Kislev.
Many of the races in the Warhammer world stand tall against the forces of chaos, whether the threat comes directly or from within their own lines. It is a constant struggle as the corrupting powers are unending and eternal. Yet, out of all who stand against corruption, it could be said that it is Kislev who stands tallest of all, the bulwark against the legions of invaders that march onto the many races of the world, a title that they did not ask for, but out of sheer stubbornness they hold proudly. The people of Kislev are all too aware of the threats that lie past their borders, the savage men who worship dark gods, the unspeakable demonic entities which threaten the very fabric of reality. Despite their nation being one of the younger nations of men, they fight like no other, even as far as stating that without them, the world would have fallen long ago. And they might not be wrong. Where countless times the hordes of chaos have risen to near limitless numbers, and they have had to march through Kislev. Towns and cities reduced to rubble, whole populations exterminated or worse, sacrificed to the darker powers to increase their hold on the world. It is Kislev who gives the other races time to prepare for what's to come. Though we are getting ahead of ourselves, there is much to discuss prior to the events where we are now, for while Kislev may be one of the youngest nations, they by far have some of the richest history. Contrary to the popular belief of most Old Worlders, the lands of Kislev are not barren frozen wastelands that the rumors may say. The winters are indeed cold, and it is dominant, but the warmth of the sun can be felt at times. The northern territories have the most influence from the cold, frozen tundras that stretch as far as the eye can see, inhospitable to most, save for the hardiest of folk. Not much grows here, for the soil is poor and the cold is sharp. These are the lands that border the chaos-touched realms of the Chaos Wastes, or the desolate and hopeless realm of Norska. While life in Kislev is perhaps more dangerous than most other nations, it is the northern and eastern regions which are more so. The closer these territories are to the northern lands, the more dangers lie within. The northern borders are subject to many chaotic incursions, most commonly through warbands and raiders seeking to prove themselves, or in a path of random destruction. Northmen who view the Kislevites as pathetic southerners with no actual strength. The Skaven to the north, those of Hellpit, are also a frequent issue, as their genetically enhanced monsters will stalk beneath the Kislevite floors. There are often tales of chittering in the dark, where entire populations of small towns and hamlets have disappeared, never to be seen again. Even within Kislev's own western borders, the lands known as Troll Country house many terrors. A hostile land of war-hungry tribes and monstrously mutated beasts. Despite the fact that these territories lie within Kislev's borders, they are very much contested and have always been since Kislev's founding. Thankfully to the south, the borders are somewhat more secure. The lands of the Empire border Kislev, both long-lasting allies for many years. They have supported each other through countless war efforts, as both see the value in good relations. Of course, it is always better to make an ally of your neighbors than an enemy. The territories of southern Kislev fare much better than the north, not only due to increased security, but the weather is also much calmer. The soil is richer, and the grand majority of Kislev's farmlands can be found throughout these regions. Kislevite towns and cities are normally very far apart from each other. The lack of hospitable lands makes sure of it. However, it is very common to see a wide variety of different settlements throughout all of Kislev. This is of course the benefit of living within such a rather large nation. Due to the dangers of said lands, many defensive fortresses can be found throughout the regions, and even its towns and cities host large walls or are strategically built upon areas which provide natural advantages. Patrols are common within its borders, much more than the softer Imperials to the south. The Kislevites know well enough that corruption often seeps in from the north, so it is extremely important to make sure all perimeters are safe. For this, many Ungol horse archers are dispatched, for they and they alone know the steppes better than anyone else. But now that we have mentioned the Ungols, it is important to note that Kislev is home to many cultures of man, 4 of which would form the foundation of what would be Kislev. Like most of the other human nations, many different cultures of people dwell within Kislev's borders. Many, of course, know of the Ungols and the Gospodars, for they are the most common folk which make up the majority of Kislev's population. Though long before the arrival of the Gospodar, another culture of human was dominant throughout the eastern regions of Kislev. These men and women were called the Ropsmen, a culture of man which, as the days have passed, have been seen less and less. Not much is known about these people, save for the fact that they controlled the region which is now known as Troll Country. These were a semi-nomadic people who had found themselves at a constant struggle against the Norsi of Norska, but also the Ungols to the east. Despite the home field advantage, the Norsi raided and attacked often, and their attacks grew larger and larger over the years. Primarily due to the Empire of Sigmar repelling the Norsi in full force on multiple occasions, where the Norsi who had settled in the lands that would become the Empire had been fully expelled. The majority of those Norsi had travelled further north in search of new lands, which saw the Ropsmen eventually subjugated to the whim of the warriors of the north. This was the start of the Ropsmen's decline as a people. Their subjugation saw them fight against the Empire of Sigmar by orders of the Norsi, with Sigmar Heldenhammer himself launching a powerful counterattack which would forever cripple their people. The might of the newly formed empire had travelled north in full force, and yes, it did lead to the freedom of the Ropsmen, but at the cost of rather large numbers. They would never recover, and their numbers would dwindle more and more, especially as their neighbours to the east, the Ungols and the Dolgan, who had recently arrived, made their way into what would be Western Kislev. Many Oldworlders also do not know much of the Dolgans of Kislev, but they are in fact descendants of the very same Dolgan who make up a large portion of the savage Kurgan tribes. Attracted to the steppes around the land, it was only natural that the Dolgans settle within the region, having set up multiple camps long before Kislev's founding. They have changed over the years, where the northern tribes have remained mostly savage, and the southern tribes adapting to the cultures which would later rule the land. Those who refused to adapt would often find themselves shunned, as the majority of the Dolgans in Kislev kept to their old faiths. Faiths which led to gods and customs that bore an uncanny resemblance to the heretics of the north. There are not many true Dolgans left within Kislev. Often they are persecuted, and it has never been outright stated that it is illegal to murder a Dolgan. Last but not least are the Ungols, the more dominant of all the tribes. The Ungols, much like all the others who inhabited Kislev before its founding, were a primal and nomadic folk, although it is known that they had also constructed some cities through much of Kislev, which acted as central camps for their people. In fact, the famed city of Prague was originally built by the Ungols. It could be speculated that these would act as various different fortress-like bastions. Especially as so many threats existed around that area during this time, it was better to build up some walls when possible. The Ungols were perhaps the most friendly of the primal tribes with the Southerners, where diplomacy was not out of the question should they have similar interests. It was very much known that the southern tribes which will eventually form part of the empire were all too busy with their own doings, and they stayed as clear away as possible from the steppes. The Ungols themselves had no interest in the more fertile southern lands, as they did not provide good areas to breed horses. There was no need to fight if there was no conflict of interest. The Ropsmen and the Dolgans, however, were not so lucky. Over the years, the Ungals grew in power and number. Ancient texts could liken them to empires and kingdoms rivaling that of Sigmar Heldenhammer himself. The other tribes were no match for the Ungal hordes, fierce warriors whose upbringing fighting the Norsi made them fear no normal mortal men. Masterfully bred horses who could travel across the steppes without tiring, and ancient magics which many claim are fueled by nature itself. With most of what would be Kislev under their control, the Ungals strengthened their position. Great cities were established to house their ever-growing populations, with large walls to combat the threats from the north. Raids from dark god-touched warriors became more frequent over the years, and the Norsi, who had once settled in the lands now known as the Empire, had been attempting to force their way into the lands of the Ungals, much like they did to the lands of the Ropsmen, since Sigmar Heldenhammer had repelled the heretics. The Norsi attacked with untold number, but still, the Ungals repelled them, even in circumstances where they were horribly outnumbered. But they were not about to let some invaders take their land, even if it meant their death. To better reference this event, it may be best to read a direct excerpt from an account during the Norsi invasion, which goes as follows. The arrival of such a large body of warriors was met with an understandable hostility by the tribes of Kislev, and the Ungals made war on the Norsi, driving them further north into the frozen lands of Norska, breaking the host of their greatest hero, Ekel Bloodheart, in the battle at the edge of the Chaos Wastes. Tales are still told of this giant, bearded warrior who hacked off his own head to deny his enemies the pleasure. Impressed with his bravery, the Ungals carried his remains south into the Troll country and built a great cairn to house his body. Some say this cairn has long since vanished, while others maintain it remains undiscovered in the depths of Troll country. Whatever the truth of the matter, Ungal legends say that the spirit of Bloodheart still howls across the steppe the night before a battle, judging the warriors who are to fight and ensuring they are worthy of traveling to the next world upon their death. While the Ungals made war with the Norsi, other threats had been rising nearby. The greenskins that had taken hold of the northern World's Edge Mountains were forming into one of the largest wars that the Old World had seen at the time. A brutal green tide marched down from the mountains onto the lands of the Ungals, destroying anything that had appeared before its path. Even the mighty Ungal horsemen's exceptional skill of skirmishing combat could not slow this tide. First, the northern and eastern regions fell, tribal homes burnt and looted, entire populations killed or enslaved. The steppes, perhaps the best fighting grounds for the Ungals, offered no advantage as they were pushed back further to the southern lands. While hope had seemed lost, as more and more Ungals died during their retreat south, this had also proved to be their salvation. For the man known as Sigmar Heldenhammer, the man who had united many tribes and formed an empire built of strength and faith, had become aware of the plight of the Ungals, knowing full well that should they fall, it would not be long until the Greenskins turned their attentions to his lands and his people. The would-be God King marched northward with a grand host to aid the Northerners. This would be the first time in recorded history that both North and South had united against a terrible foe. A mighty battle took place in the site that eventually would become the city of Kislev, where Sigmar and the Ungal warchief Subotan had fought side by side with their combined forces, shattering the Greenskin hordes. Since that fateful day, and with both peoples knowing full well that they are stronger as allies, a blood oath was made. Should either of them find their lands threatened by invaders, then the other would rise to defend and fight alongside each other. A blood oath that we all know well enough, despite the Ungals soon not being the dominant power when Kislev was eventually founded, was still held until the end of days. The Imperials would aid Kislev many times against the forces of chaos, as we know full well that the tainted hordes to the north rose under diabolical intentions. The favor, of course, was returned by the would-be Kislevites, where their thundering horses could be heard across the battlefield of what would be the first battle of Blackfire Pass. This had not been a formal treaty, such oaths were considered binding during those days, and it was not until after the Great War against Chaos that such a pact was officially formalized. Now you may be asking, what about the Gospodars, the people now commonly known as the Kislevites? Why were they not mentioned as natives of Kislev? Well, in fact, the Gospodars are not originally from the Old World, but rather far from it. Hailing from the eastern steppes, the very same lands that are home to the Kurgans, the Gospodars were perhaps one of the only tribes of men who stood against the rising influence of chaos within those regions. Many tribes, as we are aware, fell to the taint and corruption, yet the Gospodars resisted. However, they knew that as the others fell, it was only a matter of time until they were overwhelmed. Slowly, the tribes of Gospodars migrated west. The lands were safer, fertile, and a fresh start for these tribal warriors. It is said that a vision came to the leaders of the Gospodar, steppes as far as the eye could see, snow so pure and untainted by the will of chaos, a fresh start, a kingdom to stand tall. It is unknown how many had traveled to the Old World over the years, and it can be assumed that many had found the lands of Kislev so similar to their own that they attempted to settle there, though how the Ungals originally reacted to them was never recorded, but it can be assumed that it was hostile. It wasn't until the year 1500 of the Imperial calendar that the greatest Gospodar migration took place, led by the Khan Queen Miska, a mighty warrior in her own right and a powerful sorceress. Legions of Gospodar horse riders swarmed the steppes of Kislev. The Ungals, unprepared for such strength and battle tactics similar to their own but still superior, were caught off guard. It did not take long for the Gospodars to claim the eastern territories, and even grand bastions such as Prague fell before the ice-wielding magics that shattered the walls as if they were glass. Likely, this is the first time Prague properly fell to an invading force, the first of many I may add. The Ungals had been shattered and were forced to move further west, fighting the remnants of the Ropsmen in order to secure their position, eventually absorbing what was left of their people into the Ungal ranks. For a time, there was peace between Ungal and Gospodar, but this would not last for long. It would not take long for the Gospodars, now in unfamiliar claimed territory, to further push their influence over the land. They had lost much through their journey and were full aware of the horrors that rose in the east and north. They needed to solidify their position should their people stand the test of time. The lands to the west and to the south, which had access to more fertile lands and natural oceans, needed to be secured, as of course, viable sources of food were needed for a strong people. Many parties were sent forth to scout for potential enemies, and as luck would have it, the Ungals to the west were still very weak and fractured since their expulsion from the east. The Imperials to the south were also very much occupied in a civil war, a period known as the Time of Three Emperors. Much of the northern borders were left uncontested and ripe for the taking. Such opportunities rarely present themselves, and it was time for the Gospodar to no longer be seen as simple tribesfolk. It was time to form a kingdom. Striking without warning, hordes of horsemen rode into both the lands of the Ungals and the lands of the Northern Imperials. Thundering hooves tore up the ground as warriors screamed in the name of their gods to guide their weapons. This was not a war for the sake of bloodshed, this was a war for survival. Unknown to many, save for the generals of the Gospodar, the Khan Queen Miska had received a vision shortly after the campaign had begun. A dark and terrible future where the world was overwhelmed by the very forces they had originally escaped. The forces which had claimed their fellow kinsmen to the east. A world which would see the end of all things. This would forever be in place as a prophecy of the soon-to-be coming future. Miska, believing it would be up to her to bring salvation when salvation was needed the most, traveled north into the great darkness, never to be seen again. A direct account, which was not lost through time, goes as follows. Leaving her fearsome warblade Fearfrost to her daughter Shoika, Miska gathered her most trusted warriors to her and rode into the Chaos Wastes. She was never seen again, but one of the most enduring legends of Kislev is that the Khan Queen will return in Kislev's darkest hour to save it from destruction. Some people whisper that she has already done so in the guise of the Ice Queen, and the more northernly tribes of Kislev certainly fear Tsarina Catherine as much as they dreaded Miska. Shoika, now in command of the Gospodar peoples, promised to fulfill the dreams of her mother, a united land where they would rule without question. She ordered the construction of a grand city, of which it would serve as the capital of the nation. Kislev City would be a bastion like no other, with tall and thick walls. She would drop the title of Khan Queen, instead being referred to as Tsarina, the first of a long line, and so began the first year of the Gospodarian calendar, and the first year of Kislev. From henceforth, the Gospodars would call themselves Kislevites by the will of their Tsarina. It would not take long for the Tsarina to turn her attentions to the lands her mother wished to rule over. The areas which would soon enough be known as Western Kislev had resisted them thus far. Ungol warbands patrolled the lands and met the Kislevites with full force, with some of the lands to the south now firmly under their control, as no resistance was being met due to the Empire being embittered in their own civil war. The full might of Kislev could be unleashed on the west. While leading directly from the front line, the Tsarina marched forth through the west to the city of Novard, which would later be known as Erengrad. The majority of the Ungols had been held up there as a last real chance of defense. 2 years that siege lasted, but with dwindling supplies, the Ungols could not hold out any longer. The Gospodars rode in, shattering the Ungol forces and forcing them to spread out over the steppes. Over the days to come, the Ungol tribes would be tracked down and hunted. They were given the choice: submit and join, or be destroyed. It would take years, but eventually the majority of the Ungol tribes had been absorbed into the ranks of the Gospodar. Their blood and culture largely mixed, though some do distinguish themselves and refuse to mix with the other, often referring themselves by their original tribal name, in a very similar way as to how remnants of the Dolgan and the Ropsmen in Kislev will do the same. Racism between Ungol and Gospodar can be quite common, even after hundreds of years since Kislev's founding. The Gospodars naturally see themselves as superior. They are the descendants of Miska's forces, and of course they see themselves as the true servants of the Ice Queens. When it comes to the Ungols within Kislev, many of them will stay with their own tribal groups, often forming their own smaller societies within Kislev. However, it is known that as time had progressed, they have lost more of their independent right. Kislev needed to be strong for the years to come, yet still they grew in strength, and their cities populated by many cultures. This was a time that Kislev was perhaps at its strongest. Kislev's founding as a nation was long and hard, but the years to come were not any easier. With constant threats from all borders, harsh winters, and the looming vision Khan Queen Miska had so many moons ago still firmly in their minds, they knew they must always be prepared. Ungol horse archers patrol the northern borders, always moving but keeping a keen sight for such tainted terrors as the Norsi, Kurgan, monsters, and more threatened their way of life. Raids were becoming more and more frequent with each passing day, the invaders treading further into Mother Kislev. It is a great benefit that both men and women know how to wield arms. Various standing armies are poised for the call to war to repel any invaders, and should these attacks become more frequent, it is not unknown for Kislev to send forces into these neighboring lands in order to make them feel the wrath of ice and snow. Winged lancers majestically charging into enemy lines, stealthy gunfire muting the war cries of their enemies, and ancient magics throwing the very cold of the earth against them. So long as man and woman held breath within its borders, Kislev would stand, while many cities would fall and crumble, even when the literal demonic forces of the hells that are the realms of chaos manifest. There had yet to be a single force that could end Kislev for good. Only once so far had Kislev been brought to its knees, almost to the brink of death. This was when the half-demon warlord Asavar Kul had united the warring tribes of the north to lead an invasion that would shake the very foundation of the world. A great host of demons, monsters, beasts, and tribesmen advanced along the western foothills of the World's Edge Mountains. Combined forces of Kislevites and Imperials had joined once more to repel the invaders, but their strength could not pierce through the moving wall of hate and rage that marched before them. They were unsuccessful, and now the hordes of chaos marched to Prague. The siege of Prague lasted throughout the spring and summer, the city's brave defenders hurling back their attackers time and time again, with desperate heroics and stalwart bravery. But as winter set in and the year drew to a close, Prague fell and the hordes of chaos ran amok. The raw power of chaos engulfed the city, and Prague was forever changed. Its survivors fused together in hellish, inhuman shapes. Living bodies melted into the walls of the city, so that it became impossible to tell flesh from stone. Distorted faces peered from walls, agonized limbs writhed from the pavements, and pillars of stone groaned with voices that came from once human lips. Prague had become a living nightmare, and a grim warning of the suffering that lay ahead if the dark gods were victorious. Such horrors would befall the rest of the world were it not for the combined forces of the Empire, Kislevites and dwarfs. For it was during the siege of Kislev city itself that this final stand was held. Some would say that it was only at the fury and anger of the men of Kislev, watching their very homes twist and turn to chaos, that turned the tide, as if by instinct of what they had escaped long ago by traveling here, awakening inside of them. Chaos had been defeated, but this was not the end of them. Much of Kislev had been broken that day. Most of the nation itself had found itself almost to the brink of extinction. It would take many years for Kislev to recover, and even then, during that time there were many struggles. Tsars and Tsarinas had risen and fallen, and still the threats to the north had always been looming. Attacking parties of Norsi, chaotic men, or even greenskins were common during this period, as of course they saw Kislev was bloodied and broken. It would take Kislev 2 centuries to fully recover from the devastation of the Great War against Chaos. Much was rebuilt and the towns were repopulated. The city of Prague, however, still had the looming sense of corruption. Thus it was destroyed completely and built from the ground up, though many still believe that the taint of chaos had seeped into the ground where Prague now stands. Faith in the old ways had been wavering for some time now, and it is believed that were it not for the recent rise of 2 specific Tsar and Tsarina, we would not see the rise of Kislev reborn. So this is an introduction to the birth of Kislev itself and the founding of a nation. There is a lot to cover, of course. I've barely scratched the surface. My plan here was to have a few multiple videos of around 30 minutes to 40 minutes, and that way I could then explain it in much better sense. with then a final cut of around 4 hours. It just didn't make sense to release a video that's around 4 hours long, as, well, then people wouldn't really want to watch a video that long. The next part should be releasing around next week. I think I'm gonna do this once every week, as there is a lot of work to go around. There is a lot of lore, and of course, since Warhammer Fantasy is so old, there is a lot of stuff which kinda overlaps. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games, where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Birch, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel has been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.